Thanks for your understanding, your cooperation, and welcome to this session on AI and intelligence community tradecraft. My name is Louis Shepard. We are going to be playing a short introduction video by my co-moderator, the originator of the panel, and the National Security Commission on AI leader who actually devised the panel and helped us put the panelists together, Katharina McFarland, who is an AFCEA Intelligence Committee member. I'll turn it over to Katharina.
Welcome to the first live Intelligence and National Security.
Maybe we can start with the volume.
Since 2019. Welcome to all our live and virtual attendees. This is a big deal, and I'm so grateful to have the conversation.
Might restart that.
I dearly love, which is artificial intelligence. I think that you're going to find this particular Welcome to the first live Intelligence and National Security Summit since 2019. Welcome to all our live and virtual attendees. This is a big deal, and I'm so grateful to have the conversation around a topic I dearly love, which is artificial intelligence. I think that you're going to find this particular panel very interesting. We have another commissioner, such as myself, Gilman Louie, on this panel. And the topic is of very great import to our future, not just for intelligence, but today's focus is on intelligence and how it can adapt and adopt the use of and help its community grow in knowledge and understanding of its utility in the space of how do we do intelligence. And the span will be from rudimentary improving systems that we use and to actually utilizing the system to collect and understand what the nature of the world today is and how we protect the nation's security and stability. It was a very important topic when it was kicked off by Congress, and the selection of commissioners, as you probably are aware, was highly technocrat, and a couple of us that were a little bit like Where's Waldo, myself and Bob Work, who come from the Defense Department itself, mine from acquisition, Bob from policy, and obviously as a DepSecDef, an insight into all of the domain. But again, it is broader than all of us, and what we came out as a commission was a unanimous approach. Consensus was not even necessary. After 1 year having full insight into everything, we were able to, at all classifications levels, give some insights into what is important for the nation as a whole of government to adapt and adopt artificial intelligence to remain stable and economically sound. So today you're going to hear from people who have insights and analysis, data-driven. This isn't just emotion. This is not pontificating. This is insightful, and it'll be an opportunity for you to share and learn. And I wish I was there in person to be able to participate. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Louis Shepard, who's the vice chair of the AFCEA Intelligence Committee, and I wish you well, and I look forward to participating in the future.
Thank you. And we're going to go down this distinguished panel. Their introductions and bios are in your conference materials. I'm not going to repeat all that. It's the best possible panel on this topic of AI and IC tradecraft. So we're going to begin with Dr. Rita Bush, old friend, past at IARPA, past in ODNI, and now at NSA. Dr. Bush. I think they turned it on.
Yeah, I think they turned it on.
Okay.
You're live.
I'm live?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Good.
Mics are wonderful things. So thank you, Louis, for the introduction, and thank you to INSA and AFCEA for sponsoring this live event. It's wonderful to see so many of you live and in person. It's great to be able to get out of my office for a change rather than just seeing people on a VTC screen. So get to actually walk around and see people a little bit. So I'm pleased to be here representing the National Security Agency. And as many of you know, as part of its mission, we are tasked with protecting the national security systems of the US government. And it means that we're setting standards for the defense of U.S. government classified systems, and we provide general cybersecurity advice to the U.S. network defenders and to our allies. We inform those network defenders by taking what we learn from our intelligence successes about what cyber actors are doing or intending to do, and ensuring that that information gets to our network defenders. This mission involves dealing with incredible amounts of data, a large volume of data that human analysts can't possibly understand on their own without the assistance of software systems. And increasingly, those software systems are making use of AI and machine learning. I lead the NSA's Laboratory for Advanced Cybersecurity Research. Our mission is to enable our NSA mission effectiveness by advancing the science of cybersecurity and privacy to create resilient and scalable solutions for cybersecurity. We do this by employing a cadre of in-house researchers, as well as collaborating with industry and academia to advance the science and to enable our mission. And part of that research does involve the application of AI and machine learning techniques to the cybersecurity domain. We're committed to the ethical use of AI as a force multiplier to help make decisions faster and more rigorously, and to integrate across domains and replace old ways of doing things. Thanks, Louis.
Thank you very much. First of all, how many here actually downloaded the 751 pages for the National Security Commission on AI? Okay.
Did I read it?
Just downloading, get credit for that. Well, in the 750 pages, there are many, many, literally hundreds of recommendations. But one of the things we came to as a group of commissioners to the conclusion is that the US is not prepared to deal with the great competition between us and China in the AI, other disruptive technology regimes. That we as a country have to be ready, AI ready by 2025. If you think about that, this is the middle of 2021, running at government speed, there's a lot of lifting that we need to do as a country and as a community to get us there. Now, we had 4 fundamental pillars that we said needed to be done in government as well as in the intelligence community to have leadership and have technical superiority. The first one is leadership, right? Our leaders have to understand the appropriate uses of AI and how it can benefit our ability for collection, decision-making, and the entire intelligence cycle. The second area we said was talent. This is not just the S&T professionals, but every professional in the intelligence community needs to understand the data and information presented to him or her in front of the screen, whether it was curated by humans or by machine or by teaming. Hardware matters. We as a community do not have the compute necessary to deal with the challenges that ML and AI, particularly as those being used by our adversaries and our competitors against the United States. And finally, we need innovation. S&T innovation is critical to stay ahead of the game. Now, let me just say this. Our entire community has been built on collecting data and information, processing that information, analyzing it, and disseminate it for and by humans. AI is not just about enhancing humans' ability to present and understand information, but also to help machines, to do it at machine speeds. So when you think about our repositories, our data collects, our imagery, that's for human consumption. Machines need information presented to it differently. As Bob Work, our vice chair, said, We are entering into an era of algorithmic warfare. In many cases, humans get in the way of the processing, but we need human judgment because we can't just depend on what the machines tell us to do. Humans are not data junkies to actually press the buttons that the machine tell us to press. And for us to actually effectively use these technologies, we have to trust it. And we have a lot of work to build that trust between whether or not we should do what the machine is telling us, or we should ingest it and use human judgment on top of it. Now, finally, before I conclude my remarks, it is important for all of us to understand that how we think about intelligence will be changed fundamentally based on these new capabilities. And while it is important that we understand our current tradecraft, and our current tradecraft won't go away, but we need new ones. Because if we don't, we won't win in this next era of competition.
That's great. So when I was a kid, I knew about research. I knew what it meant to develop new technologies. Well, at least I learned as I got trained as a computational physicist. But what I didn't realize was the intersection of technology and policy and how relevant it was. When I was just finishing up my graduate school, I thought I would be a professor. I got intercepted on the way there by the intelligence community. And I'm very glad I did, because I learned the importance of decision support, helping people who have to make time-critical decisions with the best available information that they can. And the IC's mission is incredible in that regard. Now, you bring in artificial intelligence, machine learning technologies, and it does have a potential to change how those decisions get made, what role the IC plays in informing those decisions, and how effectively to insert that information at the right time to the decision makers that we're required. I mean, it's such a strong feeling. It's a moral imperative to support. So when you come to artificial intelligence, one of the things we do at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown, where I'm from, is trying to connect policymakers with this view of emerging technology so that they can make contextually aware decisions. AI is still an emerging technology. Yes, it's in our phones. Yes, it's part of our lives, but there's a lot more to come, especially as it pertains to the next generation of intelligence community capabilities. And when you're understanding emerging technologies, you must know where that technology is going. The yacht of scientific advancement and technical advancement is sailing across the ocean, and the rudder that is used to steer that, a lot of that is R&D, a lot of that is capabilities, and the US government, the US entirely, has a smaller and smaller size of that yacht rudder. In the 1960s, we had like 70% of that rudder in terms of dollar value. Now it's down to like 28%. And if you look at the US government, even with just in the US, it's dropping down to like 20%. You take what the IC is able to steer, and it's even smaller. So think about how can the IC not really be able to steer how AI is being developed, but be able to use it. And this is one of the things I think is extremely important as we have this discussion. We'll come back probably a couple times about how important it is to be a rapid adopter, be able to adopt the technologies that are being developed across the world, be able to innovate on them, and as Gilman was saying, build this mean and super effective human-computer trust capability that the IC can leverage and be able to use it effectively to accomplish our mission.
Phenomenal opening statements. All right. People who know me know I'm not really a milquetoast moderator or interviewer, so I'm going right at you, Dewey, on that. Okay, so CSET at Georgetown, which you lead, produce, I highly recommend the reports they've been putting out. This summer, in fact, in July, among the reports you published, your phenomenal team, 2 reports, and I'm gonna read a little phrase from each of them because I perhaps see a little tension based on that rapid adoption point you just made. Melissa Flagg and Jack Corrigan, a study that was widely read, The title, Ending Innovation Tourism, Rethinking the U.S. Military's Approach to Emerging Technology Adoption. We're talking about the IC and national security. This was mostly military focused, but IC relevant. A quote from that, quote, "The DoD must, to your point, must act immediately to implement a true innovation strategy using the authorities it currently has at its disposal. The country cannot allow perfection to be the enemy of progress." Undeniable, I would think, inarguable. At the same time, published another report, a great report by Zachary Arnold and Helen Toner. The title of that, AI Accidents, an Emerging Threat, What Could Happen and What to Do. And in her interview launching this report, Helen said that on robustness against unexpected attack vectors, quote, "This isn't a DoD problem, this is a whole world problem. The DoD has to be really forward-leaning and thinking about ways to use these technologies and then testing them and starting to consider potential use cases. Officials need to be really cautious and deliberate in actually embedding them into platforms because any platform that is acquired is likely to be in use for decades." Now, there was a very knowing and learned and experienced discussion in that report about the use of COBOL in DoD systems and the longevity of the way we acquire, deploy, and use systems, and the IC is no different. So where's the right point between rapid adoption in this world-altering technology area and that reality?
I'll take a first cut, so I'm a COBOL programmer as a kid on a PDP 11. That was where I learned how to program. So this is great that you mentioned COBOL. Makes me misty-eyed. So this is an incredibly important tension. And when I worked in the private sector, this is where it really became clear to me how this tension can be addressed. First of all, you can't deploy things in the IC if you're so obsessed with it never having any failure modes. I mean, you don't have enough time, there's too much uncertainty. It's like, trying to put together a piece of a puzzle with only a few of the pieces and no idea what you're actually putting together. Anyway, so in the AI space, continuous integration and continuous deployment is an incredibly useful framework where you go ahead and deploy. You deploy as the best available system you have. You have a testing framework around this deployment to watch for failure modes, watch for things, unintended bias, issues that are coming along, instrument it to death so that you can watch, but then you upgrade. So when you see something starting to go off, this facial recognition or classifier is dropping in performance. You deploy version 1.6.42 to fix that issue, you monitor it, and you continue watching. So I think there are continuous testing, continuous integration, continuous deployment strategies that work. However, I also want to come back to the innovation tourism comment, because in the interest of finding cool things, it's very easy to get, what's the bird that likes shiny objects, magpie-ish, and going and finding and trying to bring in the best and not even the best, but just the shiniest thing. And I think the criticism that Melissa Flagg and Jack Kerrigan are saying is be very careful. Don't just go buy postcards and trinkets from the store where you're visiting. You actually have to buy and think about the deployment of that into your system, and bringing back a postcard to your team and throwing it on their desk and saying, isn't that a pretty place? Isn't that a cool thing? Does nothing to actually advancing the mission. And so I think it's really important that we bring that in. So
I'd like to take a crack at that also, if I might. So the US government and all of the agencies are big enterprises, just like the private sector. And as someone said earlier, steering that big ship, takes a while to turn a big ship. And the government and the private sector are really no different in that respect. But I am pleased to say that in my time in the government, I have seen increasing use of the concept of DevSecOps, which is what Dewey was just referring to. The idea of quickly putting into place the development, the security, the operations. And the great thing about AI is it is not static, that the people who are out there deploying these systems recognize that it is not a case of build it once and you're done, because we know that the data and the underlying data is constantly changing. And so you have to retrain your machine learning models, your AI models, to adapt to that change in the data. And so I have hopes that we will be able to adapt, both in the private sector and in the government, in making use of this technology.
I think the good news is we're not first. And why do I say that? Because we can learn from what industry is doing, right? You look at the tech sector for all of its challenges and governance issues. They have integrated these classes of technologies, and they have adopted that DevSecOps model. And I was lucky to be a part of a Defense Innovation Board study on software, and everybody said we could not move the department down the DevSecOps lane, right? And we had 1 year to do it. We created a new color of money. We created a new way of thinking about it. Now, where are we in the scale of adopting DevSecOps? We're a long ways off, but we've started. And one of the things that we have to face, and that's going to challenge not only the department, but the IC community as well, is our speed. Our OODA loops are too long. Software is not hardware. We cannot be thinking about block upgrades. Well, I did my COBOL programming on the Honeywell cyber system. And probably some of that code is still sticking around somewhere, right? I can guarantee you that the code that you will adopt tomorrow will not be around 2 years from now, because if it is, you probably have a broken system. In this new world order where software and algorithms and data are fuel that actually fuels our engines of intelligence, that fuel gets consumed and used. The code that sits on your iPhone and your Android phone today doesn't have a speck of code from 5 years ago. Why? Because, in fact, if you ever sat in an Alphabet meeting or an Android meeting, you kind of go through all the code. It's sort of like, where do they look for all the problems? Old code. Everybody looks at the old code because we know that that's where the vulnerabilities are. So it's important for us to understand speed is our enemy, but it can also be our friend. But we have to think about software differently. And understand, this is very early in the AI cycle. The things that we think and hold dear today, like we have to suck up all the world's data, may not be true in the future. So don't get too enamored with this week's AI models.
I'm going to read a little bit of a question from the audience and also tie it into something I wanted to ask, and we'll begin with Rita. Questions from an actual U.S. Air Force major. Panelists have stated that acceleration and adoption is key, and a critical aspect to achieve that is the sharing of models and training data, so you don't have to start from scratch. Unfortunately, security is hugely hampering this. So how can we overcome this in the IC and get rapid adoption across the enterprise as well? Now, Rita, many of the vendors in the audience, software vendors particularly, IRAD partners, funded research performers for the IC, many of them actually working currently with US customers on specialized AI solutions to enable new forms of tradecraft. They wind up being frustrated, in my observation, when trying to share these solutions, models, languages, tool sets, to broader IC audiences, agency by agency, because of security. What's the NSA best practice for the Laboratory of Cybersecurity Research and the agency as a whole for your research team to keep the agency current with ML advances? How do you see that working best, optimally?
Well, the keeping everyone abreast of the advances takes multiple forms. So a lot of the work that we do in my laboratory is unclassified, and we wind up working with the private sector and the academia in a lot of these areas, and we wind up, in many cases, publishing articles, presenting at conferences, and sharing information between academia and private sector and the U.S. government in that way. Another thing that we do a lot, believe it or not, is we share publicly by doing open sourcing of the code that we create. And so there is an opportunity to partner there with the government and keep up with what's going on in terms of advances in the sciences and in the models being developed in AI.
Yeah, you know, I think everybody in the community works really hard to make sure that we're not introducing vulnerabilities, whether you're a contractor or a government employee or you're a senior at one of our enterprise or IC partners. I think the challenge, though, is this is hard. I mean, it really is. And we tend to underinvest in testing and evaluation tools, and to automate it, to actually use advanced techniques, machine learning techniques, to actually work through those systems. You know, there's been some great programs at DARPA. I think our ARPA even ran a few as well on this particular area. But it needs to be a solvable problem, because if not, if it takes a year to do an accreditation, and then once you get the credit, you're not allowed to change the code until you do it again, you know, that in and of itself is its own vulnerability, right? And so it's going to be all hands on deck, right? Both from the researchers to the IT providers, to the people running our systems, to doing the network administration, and that entire cycle. We also need to modernize their approach, but we need to invest in them. Because right now, they're under gun, they don't have the tools that they really need, and they're working against impossible schedules to deliver what is necessary for us to perform our missions.
Dewey, any thoughts?
You've said it well. Let me just throw in two challenges that I think is really relevant to this audience. So if you're going to take a continuous integration, continuous deployment, agile type of process, someone has to own the system end to end. They have to be responsible for testing. They have to be responsible, and they're the people who get fired or otherwise strung up if something goes wrong. And we have to make sure that I think government is often the case, contractors obviously play a big role, own that end-to-end capability. So when you make deployments, you have to deploy within that system. Anyway, I'm just saying there's a construct here that no, it's not ideal. No, it's not the latest capability, but being able to work effectively. One of the systems that that I was recently learning about, the Aegis weapons system with the program office there, has been implementing a continuous integration, continuous deployment type of framework. And what they've had to do is the government has had to take and make sure that they had the skill to actually be able to operate that full pipeline. Contractors had a big role, and they have a substantial role in making it happen, but the government has to own that system. This is almost the opposite of where we've been headed for many years. And in fact, the NSCAI said something that I about fell off my chair when I read, because I've never seen this in print. In fact, I even wrote it down here. In chapter 6, page 123, in case you got that far. The commission is not persuaded by the argument that the government should focus on project management and data collection and management and outsource all development. We have heard the argument from leaders who do not believe it is feasible for the government to hire, train its own AI experts. Interestingly, we have not heard this argument from industry. Anyway, so it's an extremely important point. And if we're actually going to have this operating within government on mission critical systems where the data is not, it's obviously not public, it's sensitive, it is a tension. I don't know how to necessarily thread this needle, but I think many of the people in this audience will have to figure out how to wrestle with this. One very small point is machine learning systems, the tools, the training, and the pre-trained models that are being deployed, they do reduce cost, they make things faster, However, we have to also acknowledge that they introduce threats into the deployment. We just recently published a paper called Poisoning the Well, in which we looked at how pre-trained models can actually introduce threat vectors into systems, and it's a real consideration. So all I'm doing is throwing up landmines of things that we can have to walk through. So I'm not sure it was very helpful.
But let me just give you an understanding of how complex this task is. Now, I live in San Francisco half my life. The other half, I live on United trying to come here. In San Francisco, we have pretty much every autonomous car driving company driving their cars up and down San Francisco streets because it's the most challenging environment. You know, you have bicyclists, skateboarders, 7 by 7 square miles of high density and hills. It's like fog is like the worst environment to train the system, right? So everybody goes there. For us to actually train these systems and have confidence, let me give you an idea of what those autonomous car companies do. One of the autonomous car companies has literally billions of miles of data that they have recorded into their data environments. They have a complete synthetic digital representation of the environment their systems are learning in. They have a million cores that they crunch those models every day before the next software update. Now think about our systems. That's just teaching a car how to drive in San Francisco. So we are not equipped to deal with that kind of innovation and infrastructure because we haven't made those investments.
Let me ask for a quick response from the two gentlemen. I won't ask this question the same way to the serving government official. What's I sense a little perhaps frustration and disenchantment here with the government's ability to keep up with industry and outside performance. What's been your assessment of the official IC effort, AIM, the Augmenting Intelligence with Machines, and the AIM hub that OD&I established to centralize and monitor and promote AI ML adoption in the IC? Dewey?
So everything I know about AIM is hearsay, unfortunately. So I'm not going to make my judgment off that. I think before AIM was stood up, I remember when I first joined the intelligence community, I was asked and praised for innovating. They just asked if I could stop doing things differently because it was really stressing the infrastructure. They said that tongue in cheek. They weren't my enemy. They were my friends. But it is hard. And I think operating within that and figuring out how to push that is really effective. And I'd love to see if AIM is actually achieving that. I'm so sorry. I don't actually know. Maybe others can comment on that.
I was asked early in the formation of AIM to see if I could help, but unfortunately for other reasons I wasn't able to. But let me say this, the people I personally know involved in the AIM program were all dedicated Americans. They brought in a lot of really smart people from industry as well, right? To look at the problem, and people spend a lot of time trying to get it right. So it's not without a lack of effort. I think the challenge was for that team is it was yet another activity that needed to get done, but not fully embraced. And for AIM, at least the founders of AIM and those people who participated in that program, to do it right, you have to fundamentally change and attack those things that we hold dear in the community. It would require a massive rethinking of that entire intelligence cycle, because the intelligence cycle is different in the AI, ML powered world than it is today. It isn't a linear process. As she said, it's 24/7. Every aspect, collection is completely different in the AI, ML world. What you're collecting, how you're collecting it, how you do the analysis. It isn't a cycle. It's all aspects all the time. And that means that the constructs that we constructed over the last 75 years of constructing our intelligence community was designed to process information and knowledge to get information and insight in our adversaries based on our human limitations. And so, again, I think they did a great job with what they were given. But it was only a start, and we need to go a lot further.
So I find it interesting that both of my co-panelists here are speaking as if this AIM initiative was in the past. I've heard the description was, was a great effort. This initiative still lives. It may be quieter, not quite as flashy, but ODNI is still sponsoring this work, is still putting budget behind it, and is still supporting the various IC elements in doing the hard work of introducing AI and machine learning activities into the various systems across the IC. And I do agree with something that both of you said earlier. There are some really smart people around the IC who are working on this and continue to work in this area. So AIM, the initiative continues and is supported.
Louis, can I just add one thing? This is
Yes,
Dewey over here. When I went to work in Silicon Valley, I was a little frightened actually, because I had heard that that's where the smart people go. That in fact the recruiters told me, well, we kind of hired you because of this one reason, but we really weren't thinking you were up to it because you're a government employee, and they're like that's self-explanatory on why I'm like, well, you're kind of like in the special needs category. But when I showed up, I realized that my government friends and they were more than able to roll with the big boys and gals, and they were highly competent. They were really capable. So I just wanted to point this out, that was not where I felt like there was a deficiency in terms of raw capacity. The two roles that I felt like were embraced and funded in the Silicon Valley area that were not in the government, in my experience, was the concept of a product manager and the concept of a system integration, like the true system engineers who could do things at scale. Those were people that didn't show up on the contracts, that it was hard to cram them in. Those system scale engineers and those product managers who could wrestle a problem through to completion. And maybe that's all changed now, because I've been out of the IC for a while in the government. I just want to point out that it's not for lack of talent or capability. I do think the infrastructure and how to prioritize the skills is at least where I saw was the problem. Anyway.
All three of you, great insights. The reason for asking that is trying to get to where the rubber meets the road on IC Tradecraft, on improving performance of the IC. So Rita, let me ask, really to develop along those lines of thoughts in a different way. It strikes me that AI development is somewhat akin, I pre-wrote this one. By the way, we're at the halfway point and I've gotten about almost 35 questions. And I've already used 2 of them, but here's one I wrote. It strikes me AI development is somewhat akin to the age-old development of human skills, expertise, new techniques. Humenters are by profession immersed in the world around them, hyper-aware of all events around them. At an earlier AFCEA event, we had a CIA DO leader called the Human's 5 Senses the best multi-spectrum collection sensor package ever invented. But that, of course, requires constant immersive connection with the outside world, the surrounding world. And in the same way, today's data scientists, those you lead at NSA, have to be reading open source pre-pub papers in ML, have to attend NeurIPS and other top conferences, or at least read all about them, have to be using open source widely shared programming languages, tool sets, the latest broadly available software packages and libraries. And they typically, just like those Silicon Valley counterparts, they want their innovative ideas for their own tradecraft tested and improved by colleagues. So what is that world like for data scientists at Fort Meade and at Langley and elsewhere across the IC, whose scientific tradecraft and TTPs are going to be improving if all of that effort remains on the high side?
Well,
You
that's,
mentioned your unclassified efforts, maybe you could.
yeah, so that's interesting that the last phrase that you said, all of those efforts remain on the high side. I'll take issue with that, and maybe we have the latest emergency that we've all been living through, COVID, to thank for that. We have found it possible, because we had to, that there is so much that we can do on the low side. A lot of the community that I am working with in my agency is now saying, yes, we can do stuff on the low side, and test it out there, try it out there, and then just move it up to high side when you need to then test it out against classified data or classified scenarios. So that's one response I have to your question. The other point that I'd like to make, though, is it's not just the data scientists and the folks who are gaining expertise in AI and machine learning that need to up their tradecraft game. I think it's analysts in general that we need to train to become more sophisticated about what they're dealing with in terms of the data that's coming at them. So we talk about data literacy as something that we need to instill in a larger portion of our workforce. They don't have to all become programmers and learning how to do reinforcement learning or some other exotic technique, but they do need to have the fundamentals understanding of what it means to deal with big data and to how to ask questions about what they're seeing come across their desks.
It's a hard problem again. I always start with everything's a hard problem, but look, we have, because we are the intelligence community and we have a special responsibility, the data that we collect has rules and frameworks of when we can use it and when we can't use it. Even when we can and can't integrate open source information together with that. I think we're going to have to look at those frameworks, particularly as you go forward, right? We can't responsibly simply take a bunch of data, put it into a big pot, stir it up, and boil. That would not be responsible given the great power we have. Yet our adversaries or our competitors may not have that same restrictions that we have. That's the difference between a democracy and an authoritarian country. Nevertheless, if we're going to get the value out of these systems, we have to rethink how we handle those data, who's touching the data, what algorithms and how those algorithms got constructed, to understand the biases of the information we're collecting. The other thing is that the data itself is, as I said earlier, is going to be different. In many cases, today, for example, we take sensor data and we turn it into imagery. While computers, in many cases, don't want it to be converted to imagery. They want the raw signal to be able to process against it. A little fact is, when Google was approaching DeepMinds, and they were asking how DeepMinds taught the computer how to play Breakout, it wasn't that the algorithm said, here's a brick, and here's a paddle, and here's a ball. They just put in the RGB signal to train it up. So the data is different, how we handle it is different, who's going to handle it is going to be different, and the rules of handling responsible, handling ethical use of that data still needs to be created.
I'm not going to be able to speak to how the current U.S. government is dealing with this. I do think that, however, the government and the contractor need to be very cognizant of the incentive system that they're putting together for their talent base. I think it's really important that that be thought through clearly. I remember just reading, what was it? Burn It With Fire was a book that was recently released, and it laid out how software developers and data scientists would do the wrong thing because they were incentivized to look cool to their team members rather than what needed to be done for the mission in this space. And the incentive was too powerful for them to resist. So I think when we are working with the talent base, attracting it, keeping it, or even letting it turn over, that's an okay framework to let people go do other cool things, and allow them to come in and leave quickly. But I think those are the kinds of things that we need to wrestle with. I've got a lot of thoughts on that, but I'll just mute myself now.
Okay. I want to take a different tack, again, Dewey, because of some of the great work that CSET does on looking globally. And let's look at China, our peer, state, threat, adversary, however you define it. We've had several questions about China's advances in AI. And in thinking about the IC Tradecraft aspect of this, let me put it in the context and ask for your assessment of this. I've been watching for the last year this quite startling crackdown by the PRC government on its own native technology system, its own tech sector. It started with Jack Ma and his aunt and Alibaba. It's broadened to other established large companies there, the Googles and Microsofts of China, and its own startup community, and now the native funding ecosystem and the academic surrounding data science ecosystem, the startup movement, the native startup sector. What's your assessment on this for China's ability to fulfill those strategic pillars that they've established with 2025 and 2030 and 2035 targets? And what's the impact on our own intelligence assessments of China's role as a peer, and in thinking about how it affects our own responses?
So the question is about what their own crackdown on their own internals, how that will impact that. So it will be interesting to see, but it is going back to the incentive concept. The Chinese government is incentivized to stay in power. They're going to operate so that they can stay in power. It's actually one of the things that, not that power is broadly an infectious issue, but the way that they've structured it, a single party system, it's paramount. So therefore, a lot of their actions are, whether they be wise or foolish, are going to be driven by that. In terms of how this will all play out, my crystal ball I left in my other office, so I apologize, I don't have that ready. But I can say, in terms of the diverse ecosystem, China has invested in the infrastructure, it's investing in the talent, it's investing in an approach to, they're always going to be fiddling because they need to be able to stay in power. So they might cut off a pinky toe, but the fact is they are putting an immense amount of resources in the fundamentals for machine learning and AI, and those are going to pay dividends. I do worry, because this is a very clear and present danger from my perspective, on the authoritarian use of AI. And I think it's essential that we, as part of a liberal democracy and a part of the other nations that have democratic democracies at our core, that we make very individual and collective decisions that we drive toward and shape the terrain of AI competition so it benefits democracies. And I know this isn't exactly what you're asking, but I just want to come, because I think it's so important and it actually represents this competition space. We have to offset the authoritarian advantage in the big data AI approaches. They've clearly demonstrated strong capabilities. And I think we do have very strong levers that we as innovators, we as contributors to the intelligence community's mission, build up dependencies, build up systems that are not all surveillancy in the sense that they must just have all data. They work with small data models. They work with these different constructs that actually are for the advantage of democratic institutions. And I think undermining social control of ML. I think there's a lot of things we can do to show adversarial solutions to Chinese problems that would be actually really it would strongly advantage democracies. And I think we just need to think about this. But anyway, I digress, so I'll leave it there.
Thoughts on that?
I think it's easy to misread the Chinese, right? Because A, we don't have the technology to peer in people's brains at this moment in time yet. We're working on that. But all kidding aside, if you think about the actions that have been taken recently, Alibaba, Tencent, Jack Ma, 40% of their enterprise values of their tech companies coming off the top in the last 6 months. Those are big moves, right? I think it'd be a mistake for us to think that that's the start of a bigger problem for them. Let's be clear. China's been around for 3,000 years. And the reason why they've been around for 3,000 years is they have survived leadership change after regime change after revolution. When they say that security and harmony are their top 2 priorities, it isn't just to stay in power, but it's how they view how they as a society, kind of a top-down view, that kind of fatherly view as they would look at it, to perpetuate their culture and their society. And they're willing to give up things that our society is not willing to give up, and that's individuality and democracy. The other thing to understand is they learn very much from our actions on the West. So they see the threats of idealism being broadcast across these new technologies. That these 2 new technologies are forms for dissimilar viewpoints and argument and expression. And that could be a very big threat to their society. And so when they see leaders, business leaders, even their film industry, which is also going through a crackdown, threaten that, they're communicating to their internal communities, their business communities, that we are in charge, not you. It's military-civil fusion, not civil-military fusion. And the priority first is the state, and we will be willing to take any pain to perpetuate the state. So don't read this as, aha, they tripped, they stumbled. This is just another step in the progression of how they want to see dominance and technologies, that view of authoritarian control of information and knowledge that goes through these systems. So, I'm not looking at this as something that's permanent. This is like getting their people in line to let them know who's boss.
So that's a really interesting question, and I think it's one that we should put to CSET, because I bet they could write a great report on that, right, Dewey?
Sure.
But seriously, there are a lot of things actually that we ask the private sector to do for us within the intelligence community and the government in general. So, I mean, that's just another example of the great partnerships that we can get with the private sector. The US government doesn't have all of the answers. We don't have necessarily all of the talent. For the matter of AI and machine learning, there's still a lot of work to be done, and fundamentally, the private sector is always going to have more money and more people to throw at this than the US government does, because the private sector is big. And so we in the US government need to take advantage of what is going on in the private sector in this area, and be the rapid adopters that we have been encouraged to be. So I think that building those partnerships is really essential to our success in this area.
Rita, what's been the most valuable channel for you in this new, changing, much more unclass-friendly and unclass-resident area of work for cybersecurity research, what's the best channel for engagement that you've been finding with
let's
industry and partners?
The best channel for engagement, VTCs. But, you know, it sounds a little old-fashioned, perhaps, but networking really does work. You know, reaching out and finding the right people to talk to via, you know, the friend of a colleague of a friend. And so I do miss these sorts of events, and I am so glad that we are starting to see those again. You know, based on my prior jobs that I've had, I've spent, you know, lots of times coming to these kinds of events, and it really does work in terms of finding the right people to talk to. Whether you're the company that has a solution to sell or the U.S. government representative that's looking for a solution, these sorts of things are just fabulous.
I know you've put your effort where that counts at OD&I with private sector engagement, which you helped run for years. But to forestall there being a long line of people wanting to meet with you at the end, I mean, is there an email address or a particular website that people are encouraged to go to for?
Sure. At risk of getting flooded, I'll just put my own personal email address out there, rmbush@nsa.gov. Don't everybody send it at once. My server may crash, but.
You probably have machine learning bots that are going to be mining that for really good stuff.
Yeah, it could be.
So that's good. Well, Gilman, I don't want to go back 3,000 years. We only got like 5 minutes left. But if you were to look back, so the neural network revolution has really occurred over the last decade. You know, maybe 15 years of patient investment, mostly in the private sector and academia, by the luminaries today, the Turing Award winners, literally, of AI. Early in that epoch, you were a leading voice in U.S. government and IC investments for S&T. I won't ask you to grade In-Q-Tel's efforts over the last 20 years either, but you guys are terrible graders. But how do you look today at the IC's ability to patiently invest in potentially radical and revolutionary benefit in foundational research ourselves? And is that meshing with industry R&D?
Well, somebody once asked me when we were starting In-Q-Tel, what's the most important asset the community has? And there are a lot of great assets. You know, our people are great, right? Our mission is great and worthy, right? But when I wear my commercial hat, the thing that stood out, the big bet when we created In-Q-Tel, was the most valuable thing that we had were our problems. Our problems are worthy, they're big. In many cases, leads industry. You know, we were doing big data investments before there was big data. Don't forget, Oracle was Project Oracle, right? And if you can look at the things that from imagery to deep data analytics, even search engines were funded by NSF and had IC investment in those categories before it was known as search. We still have big problems. Worthy enough that people would sacrifice, scientists and engineers and entrepreneurs would sacrifice wealth just to get their fingers on those knotty problems. Not all, but many. And so I think I have great hopes that this community, even more so today than back in 1999 when In-Q-Tel got started, right? Our willingness to engage with industry. And I think COVID did change how we looked at things, right? That at the end of the day, the virus doesn't say, you're an IC member, I'm gonna attack you, or your industry, I'm gonna avoid you. It doesn't care. And so whether it's man-made, done by nature, we have many different threats. And I think we have an opportunity to continue to engage with industry. Now, we also have something that industry doesn't have. We have patient capital, right? The Tradecraft that we built up not only in the community, but in great institutions like DARPA and IARPA and NSF, and the work that we do with UARCs and FFRDCs, right? Industry won't put their dollars in there because it's too early, too bleeding edge. In many of these categories, like quantum computing, right? Now it's getting a little bit sexy, but we were doing it 2 decades ago. So I think the community continues to lead industry in their thoughts and the problems. We just need to be willing to kind of change our systems and improve it to be more efficient and more streamlined so we can tighten up that OODA loop.
Let me ask a final question, and we'll go with Dewey, then Gilman, then Rita. Thoughts on this? FCS several years ago, we had Elon Musk here, and it was in 2015. It was right when he was beginning to talk about AI, and particularly artificial general intelligence, or super intelligence. And he kind of, at the time, was sounding a klaxon about that, and the formation of OpenAI and several other efforts. I'm curious about IC Tradecraft. How well does, or should, or could the intelligence community do traditional I&W for the emergence of artificial general intelligence? It's a hard problem to collect on, but it's a necessary area of interest for the IC, for its own tradecraft and collection priorities. Any thoughts on, from CSET's perspective, and viewing the landscape of outside parties as well, industry, R&D monitoring, how well is the government doing and what could be done?
So I think it's a really relevant question. AI is quick moving. There's a lot of innovation going on, and the analytic problem of tracking emerging technologies, particularly AI ML, is a first-class analytic problem. I mean, separating it from the actual usage in the IC, but as itself, is it a first-class problem? Because innovations, even before we get to AGI, could be very disruptive to capabilities. It's very important from my perspective to set up an indications and warning type approach. In fact, CSET has made investments, it's not been made public, to actually set up a indications and warning platform and this is one of our test cases. Can we see signs of people's dedication? I'm not trying to claim that we can predict when AGI will be, when the singularity will come or something like that. However, we can say people believe this is important and they're putting more attention and time into it. The Chinese call it, and I can't say it in Chinese, my apologies, general artificial intelligence. They invert a little bit. And they are, or maybe we inverted a little bit. Anyway, I didn't mean to. But I think what they're doing is we see significant focus in intersections of bio-inspired work. We see a lot of indications from a lot of infrastructure, a lot of compute structures being built around this. So there is the intent to build up the system, and therefore it's essential that we put up an indications and warning system. One comment about how to do that, and I realize we're already getting close to over time, is I do believe that open source information is the contextual framework it must be started from. Human and SIGINT are niche ints in this space. I'm not saying they don't have a very strong utility, however, they're not the primary source, and they can augment the storytelling. And I think this is essential that the government be aware of, and it's not just AGI, it's the related technologies that are like. So I'll leave it there.
Good answer. Gilman?
Well, we're still several steps away from even smelling whether AGI would become real, but I would agree with you that getting the indicators and warnings and sensing and seeing where everybody else's bets. This is not just the Chinese, right? Everybody in the world are trying to make bets to go down particular lanes of breakthrough, even down to synthetic biology and looking at more natural forms of intelligence being incorporated with machines. Our current kind of cycle of using ML or kind of deep learning models will run its course and it will have its limitations, and there will be new models coming forward. I would not discount the impact of those models having huge changes even in what we think today a machine can and cannot do. So this is, we're what, third generation of AI? Depending on how you count it, right? We're probably, if you put AGI out at generation 8, we still got a ways to go.
Agreed.
Rita?
So when I talk to my local in-house experts about this question of AI and general AI versus narrow AI, which is how most of it is defined to be today, there's a lot of discussion and argument about whether general AI is indeed possible. So I don't think that the AI community itself is settled on that or is of like minds on that. What I would say that I would be more worried about and concentrating on, and I think my co-panelists have alluded to this, is just the continuing evolution of the use of AI in new and novel ways, and just the general progression that we are all making in terms of pushing the bounds of what's possible. And so we need to watch and see how AI, as it currently exists today, not general AI, but narrow AI, as it exists today, is being applied in more and more fields and making decision-making and automation faster and more things possible. So in the cybersecurity field, that is scary for me in terms of what it may be possible that the adversary could be doing and what we might need to do to be able to rapidly respond to that. So we are told, there are various academics who say, yes, this is theoretically possible, that you could start doing, AI-driven attacks, cyber attacks. It is theoretically possible that you could do AI-driven responses. So we're just watching the bounds of what is possible and, preparing for the day when that possible maybe become reality.
Outstanding, outstanding. This fascinating discussion and panel have kept you, the audience, 5 minutes into your networking break. I apologize, but I think we could go on for another hour. Shall we? No, we won't, but I want you to join me in thanking the panelists for and thank them for their service to the nation as well. Okay, you now have a half-hour networking, or almost half-hour networking break in the exhibits outside. Thanks very much.